Time for me to open this morning's session into the examination of island planning strategy. I'm going to skip over our introductions because I think everyone's been here before, so I'll skip over most of that. A reminder to turn off, or at least silent, mobile phones and email settings. Check with the council. Eye test.
No plan by drill.
Thank you. Another quick reminder, if you've got any queries about the examination when Louise. Yeah, another reminder that examination hearings are held in public and they are being live streamed. Those who've submitted duly made representations on the submission version of the plan by September last year and who have expressed their right to be heard will be able to speak and participate this morning. Morning's session concerns itself with approach to site selection. We've read the representations and statements that have all been made. There's no need to read out any statements. The aim of the hearings is to help inform our assessment as to whether the plan in respect of the approach to site selection is sound, justified, effective, positive, prepared, consistent with. What's helpful to us is where you consider the plan is not justified or not going to be effective, tell us what needs to be changed to the plan and why. Are there any No. Okay, thank you. I don't think we need to go through.
Thank you, Mr. Steen. Good morning, everybody. Pleased to see the council chamber still in place, so back here. Morning's session starts our discussion of matter 6, which is housing sites, the island plan strategy. This morning's session will be dealing with general approach and methodology, specific sites, and yesterday, and that may component of the plan. Going through separate sessions in terms of some specific sites. Sessions. Quite specific requirements. Sites were effectively narrowed down sites that are plan and a discussion we discussed over the past couple of days. Now, I appreciate this is a plan that's difficult down stations. Really neat. Scale sites, so relatively lenient. What sense check. Some plan examination. Allocated sites. Just in the small process of sites that so most of our questions probably specific for turn to the first part of our agenda. It also reflects our starting point of potential health sites and to look at strategic assessment. It's one of the key kind of documents sites taken to identify questions again keen out at pre-sessions self as a patients evidence plan making over to that's been undertaken as part of sustainability questions 70 narrowing so in terms of process in our matters council that sort of combination of general terms to potential sites have been initially considered sites lived out.
Thank you, sir, and good morning. Yeah, I suppose I'll get an overview. Timeline. So I guess if we go back to previous version 17, so that was effectively sites. Off by the but so that informed that first kind of touched on the days that Reg 18, first Reg 18, second Reg 18 changes. That's so 18 was published. About that time, the kind of rights on the council that's always their job. Such. Following that second reggae, two, and that. I think that is a piece of that then kind of sustainable. That filtering, just the housing requirement, it's regulated. You'd have to do exercise of filtering sites out. Judgment, those filtering reasons. Second last one. Package of sites. Touched on some of those reasons. A couple of days, size being. That's a kind of less. Laws. Less than the method. Outcomes of that, that's a slightly better than.
That's helpful. Stay on the strategic housing land development. Journey. Just going back to the housing and availabilities. That discount. Stage A. Clear-cut kind of environmental. Sites. Venice. Environment. Those is ancient. Sites. Disconnect. Concerned about. Haven't been.
Yeah, thank you, and comments on in terms of that actually timing effect. Two, the policy. The conversations in the House of Lords taken. So, and we didn't think it was not for number of sites that effect is relative. affected the two potentially that it covers off. So effective whole of the slope.
Let's say that it change had been the other way about. If then have failed that. So it's not, there are signs. Had we had a different, say the div set at a lower level, I think they would obviously also be excluded. So there aren't any extra sites back in, only that the sites that are about those in the, that's the change was a change.
Thank you a lot. Some site allocation. Concerned about. I take the point. I mean, that sort of reopen.
On that point, you need to rerun that slower process to do that in terms of the policy.
Certainly given that that is a live issue, it would certainly be helpful. So no, at that. Then.
Thank you. And then under the stage B, part of that assessment process through, so for flood risk. If I say that they're not necessarily, that the exceptions site this afternoon in terms of flower process ordinary.
Yeah, and Mark is fair one. Sites maybe
that subsequently set out in the SLA where that's recorded sites that can be treated on an exceptional pattern of system.
At the time of Charles written, they had in front of it.
Thank you. And then discussed yesterday greater allowance for nights through the process. We are five lower than 10. Low 10.
Yeah, that's correct. So the SHAR does provide that kind of package of sites, if you like. Touched on yesterday, a number of those were first iteration, and filtering reason took was using 10-unit threshold in that one. Progress through plan making. I think, you know, and through SHAR that in the SHAR starting point, technical evidence, SHAR doesn't have plan sites, SHAR, which are not patient judgment, that can that through the plan. Undoubtedly, people agree with that. That's part of the process. Journey, I guess, set out judgment.
Part of Mr. Brewer's kind of dating again at the assessment process to virtual counting and considered further. There are kind of 2020 further criteria sites that are located side of the set to it.
So 18 and the 22 page in first, which you made. Change management, Ireland, and policy on that. With the three additional kind of that 22.
In terms of the council's application, is it those sites to be lived out at that stage, both outside of the South? No.
Probably the emphasis is on the word outside. So the word outside can sometimes literally the other side of the fence. Outside, that wasn't the fence in which.
Yeah, basically said I'm just trying to get a page in the SLA that, and I'll
Page
to do it.
15.
Sets out what that is, and further on into does provide rationale around. Essentially, if you said we were sites, didn't have that. Page 16.
That 5.
Sorry, set still a what's the context? Black and white if you're out.
That's helpful. Describing our sort of vendor item relatedness are 2022 document. Technical area where things have changed. Datedness. Around about 2 years. Further call. Right option. Work that.
So I guess in terms of the timing that you're correct to document 20, that version of the IBS had a journey, should we say, to go through time. Change in that time. So effectively the draft, which was very similar to the version obviously that changes. So in terms of the purpose of its document that's date, as I said right at the start, the call for sites is permanent. So within application process, well, determination of planning application part of this conversation. Some sites they may have a planning application, go through that process and have been through that. Any potential and then of course make have potentially a be that would be picked.
Thank you. So having taken that in size, initial pool of down to correcting this. Then go through assessment, living as sites are. Certainly the seemed to us from looking at that that stage. Was that a note were discounted. Dip to it. I mean, looking at the Schlar itself, I mean, it's failed in terms of assessment of sites, obviously. Generally from the subsequent dipping you've
it's again part of the evidence-based plan. Schlar was not. Spatial strategy options that we take forward in the second regulated. Undoubtedly, there was an element of kind of policy on, if you like, in terms of that further piece of Schlar work. That's to the guidance and Schlar's. I think conversations yesterday around the spatial strategy and the approach we're looking to take through plan and particularly G2, then that's where we're at in terms of allocations within the plan itself. Standing, obviously, we had that wider package, first Reg 18. Again, a number of those outside of settlement boundaries.
But be at that stage, Mr. Through that process, sites that were in sustainable rural settlements lived out at stage, but side settlement bound, definitely having a meaningful
size as well, because of some of those sites would be up to the shoal somewhere that. So yeah, you're absolutely right. So the conversation we had yesterday around those certainly kind of outside rural service centres and rural settlements, that would be the case. Things that's reflected in the package of sites we had in the first Reg 18. I think I've got it on my spreadsheet, but no one else can. But there's a long list of sites which were anywhere between kind of in and around those areas, which were obviously there out for the reason which will probably come on.
Before I bring in others, then finally, as a result of that process, appendices 5 and 6 of the housing land assessment, all the sites that are in appendix these 5 and 6 then go on sustainability, their path.
And obviously some that weren't as ASA processes started with that wider package of sites at the first Reg 18 stage. So sites kind of got through that SA process.
Just so I can work that through. So sites that were potentially in the Reg 18 didn't necessarily go back into that again and out potentially through these 5 and 6 separately banked as kind of being sustainable option. Go through the Schlar.
No, so they did go through the Schlar process again, go into the ISA process, and I'll probably that up. So go into the sustainability appraisal process. The sustainability process looked at a package of sites than just proposed allocations which fell out of the Schlar.
Thank you. Still on item 1 of the agenda and the mechanism of the strategic housing assessment. First assessment living process. have started. Long list of all the sites that have professional capacities put forward sites on behalf of themselves into that process. And any points where they are related to your adequacy in the method council and
yeah, try and keep it to point one. It's hard against environment policies, etc., which we'll discuss next week. I've only some of my representations kind of framed under my representation policy H1, but it is interlinked. I mean, I think just from I might be wrong, but the I can't remember. My grey matter fades me, but the 2018 SHLA, the 21 sites just naturally got extended. I don't believe there was a new SHLA process in 21, but Mr. Brewer might clarify that. I might be wrong, but the SHLA process, as per my representation in 2018, was much more ambitious, and the sieving process led to that kind of allocations process in more robustness. I suppose as of yesterday, we had common ground that the issue wasn't about land availability in SHLA, or indeed probably environmental considerations. It was about market response to take up. And in representation, try and keep it on point one, is that in H1 para 7.12, just on the slight touch on yesterday's, the windfall site, the reason for the SHLA process looking to the allocations of small sites, somewhat framed by para 7.12, which talks about the island traditionally and still operating via small builders. And it talked about 4 or less. And I appreciate that the council has to take a stance on, you know, setting a reasonable threshold. I appreciate it's been virtually impossible to allocate sites for 1 or 2, you know, but it comes down to the policy hierarchy, actually drilling down probably to the smaller, I forget the name now, it was only yesterday, smaller sustainable settlements. You know, they're probably the kind of target audience against 7.12 the smaller builder would operate in at the moment. And so going back to the 2018 sieving process to inform the Reg 18, where, you know, there were a range of sifted SHLA sites into allocation, felt much more robust and sound in order to go back to the market demand point, not the environmental constraints of SHLA itself. And therefore, you know, it just felt more robust in 2018 to deliver the quantum required.
so back to the council, but I hear from others. I think it was Mr. Gentleman next, then Councillor Jarman, and then Mr. Farrell. So Mr. Gentleman, please.
Thank you. Yeah, my representation, I raised some concerns about viability, and in the up-to-dateness of this, you know, between 2018 SHLA, which, as David alluded to, my understanding is the same, that sites have rolled from that SHLA process into this SHLA process. Viability of sites has changed considerably. Build costs in current day between 2021 into 22 to 24 have risen by about 15%. That's very significant as a rise in build costs. During that time, we haven't seen significant rises in property prices. And although build costs generally make up a smaller degree of the pie, the development pie, if you like, against the greater value, that has a specific effect with viability. When you start to look at more marginal areas, and those areas are where stock is at a lower value, you start to hit viability problems. Viability of problems can occur from the relationship between build costs and sales prices, which, as I'm alluding to, have changed very significantly in the time that this process has been going on. They can also occur because of rate of sale of a particular type of product. For instance, if you were to look at a flatted scheme, we've touched on this in other conversations, but for the benefit of this being up to date, if you were to look at a flatted scheme in a specific area with 1 and 2 bedroom flats, your market take up on that would not be huge. You know, you're not going to be selling 40, 50 units a year. It's going to take quite some time to sell out a block. So therefore, larger scale flatted developments take a long time to work your way through as a developer. The longer a scheme takes, the greater the interest costs. In combination with that and the rise in build costs between the 2018 SHLA, which was a very detailed, in-depth process, which involved industry people sitting in the room with planners discussing viability of sites specifically and how we would view as developers. I was part of that SHLA process, whether a site is economically viable. My concern is that when we look at today's process, I don't believe that that viability process has been reconsidered with the allocations that are in today. And I believe that's changed very significantly. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's Councillor Jarman next, please.
Thank you, sir. First of all, I should say that I wasn't involved in the 2018. I hadn't been elected at that point. I came into the process a little bit later. But at the end of 2021, we did have a group who were looking, they were called the Planning Protocols Group, and they were looking in some detail at historical measures that have been applied within the planning process. So without jumping ahead to items that we've got later on this list this morning, and talking at the general level of that, we did acquire quite a lot of the minutes and details of how the process at SHLA in 2018 had been conducted. And that led, in fact, into the peer review that came later into the council and is still, in some ways, an ongoing process. I did look back very late last night at some of the concerns that were raised in that. And one of the things that came out quite strongly was, first of all, getting access to those historical details was quite difficult. We did in the end get some of them through other cabinet members who've been there before. So I was grateful to Councillor Price in particular for that, but also through the planning officers themselves. Unfortunately, the links that we were provided to those documents no longer work. I assume something has been superseded in the intervening period that they're no longer accessible. I don't know why that is, but that's simply the case. And I'll forward the links on to James actually later today, and he can ascertain why that is. We were concerned, and I suppose this is a general point, about the openness and transparency of that process. And although the minutes were held at the Sea Clerk's offices and minuted, they weren't in a public forum where people could be part of that examination and understand the detail of it. Clearly, the process was not a public one in that sense. We also had an issue with the process in relation to the attendees at those meetings. In fact, there are quite a few of the people who attended those meetings who I can see in the room with me today. They didn't include the environmental groups that we would have expected to be there as part of that sustainability discussion. So there wasn't any Natural England, wasn't CPRE, there wasn't RSPB, and all the other environmental concerns. And also, we couldn't find a record to Southern Water attending them. And Southern Water, in terms of sustainability for water and sewage, is quite, a key issue. Was then, has been since, and is likely to be in the foreseeable future. So those other organisations who would be absolutely key to the process seem to be unrepresented. Now, whether they would have made a material difference or not, I don't know. I suspect the input from Southern Water could have been enormously useful, looking at the detail of which we now have in terms of real-time telemetry, the loading of pipes and networks within each area. And it might have been that would have become a criteria for assessing the viability of a site. If we knew that a particular area was already at 160% of sewage capacity, I'm just giving an example, it would seem rather unrealistic to put sites forward in that area to add to that load, unless there was a plan to substantially upgrade the infrastructure of the Southern Water Sewage Network prior to that occurring. And because that wasn't the case, and because other developments did occur afterwards, the consequence was that already overloaded infrastructure became more overloaded. It clearly had nowhere to go, and the only option was, which is a fairly massive increase of discharges in various places, including, of course, into sites of SSSI and SAC, the Afton Marshes, Yarmouth Harbour, Norton, Solent, etc. So I think there was an opportunity, I'll say it that, which was missed. And I think in terms of the sieving process, that could have been an absolute key component.
And from Mr. Farrell, please. So I don't know if you might need to use the microphone if people
I do
are
apologise. Yeah, so
observing.
just touching on Mr. Gentleman's points earlier on viability. Mine's slightly different to that, in as much that in terms of the keeping it to the SLAR and the impact upon that, the viability of those changing between 2018 and 2022, there is a significant difference. And into there, and I'd like just to touch on one particular policy that's been brought in, which does have an impact, and whether that impacts the SLAR and whether that's been taken on board. That's policy EV5, which has this impact of 50 metres. Sites that have come forward in 2018 that wouldn't have had that may be impacted, not solely so they're discounted, but the amount that they can actually bring forward would be impacted. And that in itself brings forward a question as to whether that impacts the number of housing that is being brought forward is sufficient. Therefore, that's my question really, is the impact of that EV5. It is softened in some of the instances, but EV5 Part D does actually state that it's 50 metres. And then later on paragraphs, it does actually suggest that it may be appropriate to extend that even further. That impact on the number of housing delivery on sites that have been allocated or suggested to be allocated in the SLAR, that would impact the numbers. Thank you.
Thank you for those. So if I come back to the council, there's a number of things I just want to pick up that's been raised, and I'm sure the council would want to respond to them in any event. I think the first area is around did the 2022 SLAR just simply roll forward the 2018? Presumably there was a reasonable amount of overlap because sites are promoted as sites, but were there additional sites that were considered, Mr. Brewer?
The short answer is yes, there were. So there were additional sites considered in 2022 SLAR that had been suggested through the plan making process since the first iteration of the SLAR was undertaken. Obviously, it was a standalone piece of work. It was a comprehensive piece of work. It followed, as did the previous SLAR, the government guidance on how to produce those documents, and that's clearly set out in the methodology of both of them. So, but there were additional sites considered.
Then in terms of, I'll describe it as the kind of the reasonableness of kind of a degree of kind of policy onness. I know we don't like policy off, policy on anymore, but I'm afraid I'm too long in the tooth to easily readily move on. In particular, again, this issue of outside settlement boundaries and whether the SLAR was justified in sort of taking that approach, and sort of how rigidly that was kind of applied potentially. I appreciate this from a sort of looking at sustainability, kind of has to be some reasonableness, and if the site is very much not kind of well related to existing settlements, that's an issue. But it's whether through the revised or the updated 2022 SLAR has effectively been, perhaps some might say, a sort of too sort of zealous application, and too many sites that are reasonably related to existing settlements were quickly dealt with through the SLAR process, rather than perhaps going on into sustainability appraisal and being looked at in more detail there in terms of fit with a strategy.
I think it's at this point really useful to point to paragraphs 5.3.1.3, it's a bit of a mouthful, to 5.3.1.6 of the 2022 SLAR. And that sets out the kind of rationale on this issue of kind of outside of settlement boundaries, and kind of sets out that it wasn't just you're outside, that's it. There was thought process, and, you know, as HELA guidance sets out, other factors can be taken into account in a SLAR, include national policy. National policy requires, you know, places weight on accessible places. When we look at what was then paragraph 73B and 84D, obviously that application of those paras came into that consideration when we're looking and thinking about that outside. It wasn't a blanket outside, that's it. There was kind of thought process around, I think, some of the points you made around proximity, and as I touched on earlier as well. So yes, there was that additional stage, but we wouldn't describe it as overzealous. We would describe it as entirely reasonable. And again, we come down to the fact that the SLAR is a piece of technical evidence. There are elements of planning judgment in that, and that's the process that we've been through.
So would it help you or not if we were, because obviously the SLAR is a bit of an unwieldy document with all of its appendices. Obviously, you can go through the appendix and see which sites have been described as immediately adjacent to a settlement boundary or outside of settlement boundary and no meaningful relationship with it. And obviously, once you know which site it is, you can then look it up and see what that is and see where it is. Would it help you if we gave you some examples of the ones that are in that category where they've been excluded as having no meaningful relationship, so that you're able to get a feel for how the council exercise that planning judgment? Or would that not be helpful to you?
I'll think upon that request. I mean, obviously, what's in my mind is that this plan has allocated sites that are adjacent, or it will now be within the revised settlement boundaries. So I can see it's not been a case that you've not gone there and not identified kind of new sites. But I think at this stage I'll reflect on that offer, and if I think it's something that would assist, Mr. Bedford will let the council know through the programme officer.
Thank you, sir. And I think this also talks to the point we discussed yesterday around size of sites and those smaller sites, because I think that kind of filtering process predominantly looks at those kind of 4s and 5s in areas such as sustainable rural assessments, which obviously would previously be identified for allocation in the first Reg 18 version of the plan. So I think that covers a lot. I suspect, you know, if we do have to provide that list, a lot of them will be those sites.
Just going through that and picking up some of the other points that were raised around the degree to which the potentially external kind of inputs, I think, for example, highways or Natural England or other infrastructure providers. In terms of the 2022 strategic housing land availability, did it follow after the second regulation 18, and would those, particularly those kind of statutory consultees, have been aware through that process or engaged through that process around where the kind of the spatial strategy was kind of heading towards? So if they thought there was a particular issue with a particular settlement or location, would you have known at that stage through the second Reg 18 process to then potentially feed into the SLAR?
Short answer, yes, correct. So obviously representations made through that second Reg 18 process did then assist in the formulation of that kind of second SLAR document. So we were able to consider some of those points made. I think, you know, we obviously need to be, we need to caution that what the SLAR is and the role of the SLAR and who's involved in the preparation of the SLAR. It's not a public consultation exercise. It's not an exercise where you consult statutory consultees as a matter of kind of how you produce the document. Obviously, their input can be important, and we have the previous Reg 18s to pick up commentary from those statutory consultees to feed into that process. But essentially, it is a piece of technical evidence. The council, in producing both of the SHAR documents, took advice where it needed to. You raised the issue of highways. That again is a particular issue where, certainly from a SHLAR perspective, technical advice was taken as part of those SHLAR processes.
And then one of the outputs of the SHLAR process is to kind of look at the yield, what sites are going to deliver. The point's been made. We'll come and look at plan-wide viability kind of further towards the end of next week in terms of effectiveness and the delivery of the strategy that's before us. Just so I'm clear, Mr. Gentleman, from your perspective, so is your concern that the viability, less sites are effectively going to be deliverable, so more should be discounted and sieved out? Because
absolutely, if you've got something that fundamentally does not look viable at this stage of the process, it should be sieved out, because we are just leaving ourselves with something in the allocation that's not going to get delivered. So the assessment of viability is difficult, and in assessing viability, I would urge that advice is taken from those in the industry, and specifically those in the industry on the Isle of Wight, who understand the local market and the issues about it. But yes, absolutely, if something is not viable, we're leaving ourselves with something in a plan that is not going to be delivered, and we're leaving a hole in our delivery. So it's important that's considered. Thank you.
Thank you. In terms of the council, my assumption would be it would be for the plan viability assessment work to look at that, having gone through the sieving process, and you then put in kind of various sites, particularly key sites.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rather than an earlier stage.
Yes, so from a SHLAR perspective, you're looking at that the definition of achievable. So there is a judgment around the potential economic viability of the site, but at that SHLAR stage, it's quite difficult to come to a definitive judgment on that. Obviously, the SHLAR is one part of the evidence base that feeds the plan, as is the viability assessment as well. And obviously, the viability assessment, which we'll come on to next week, looks at different typologies, which obviously of development, which obviously then cover off the type of allocations that are being made in the plan. So absolutely, I take Mr. Gentleman's point. You're absolutely right. There's no point promoting loads of development that isn't viable, but that there's a judgment at different stages of the process to make about that, and it is challenging, and it changes. It's a bit same like housing trajectory, isn't it? A viability assessment today is very different to viability assessment 2 months ago. So there is a kind of judgment call and a proportionality aspect to it, and we'll come on to that, no doubt, in a bit more detail next week. But fundamentally, the SHLAR doesn't go into detail on viability. It has to make a bit of a call, a judgment on it. But at that stage, that's not the purpose of that document, I'd say.
And then similarly on yield, for Mr. Farrell's point, obviously we picked that up initially as part of this discussion around the impact of policy EV5. We will look at that on specific sites, and we'll look at, again, the soundness of that policy approach next week as well. But I think the council indicated that's possibly an area. I appreciate they say you take the submitted strategy, in the grand scheme of things, it's not a significant issue, but maybe when we start to look at other things, there may be merit in updating that particular evidence. Interpreting the council correctly and not committing them to something they haven't offered in the fullness of time.
I think the 15 and 50 metre buffers have appeared in different versions of the IPS to date, and we'll discuss that in a bit more detail next week.
Okay, before I move on to item 2 of the agenda and we kind of get on to the sustainability appraisal, Councillor Jarman, you want to come back in?
Thank you. I feel somewhat cautious at this point, because we're inevitably dealing with a moving feast with the situation with the council in regards to land and allocation and the policies of the council which impact some of those decisions. There has to be some, I'm not sure what the process is, but I assume there is some cut-off date by which you know, there has to be stability to a plan to move forward. And were we to keep looking back at what's changed since the last version of the publication of the plan, the council is constantly putting out new policies regarding sustainability, and new policies indeed are coming out from Southern Water as well. We've got one recently regarding the separation of grey water and foul sewage, which has an impact. My concern would be that if we don't choose a point in time against which to assess the plan, we would be constantly dealing with revisions to policies which would affect the decision basis of that plan moving forwards. And that would destabilise potentially the whole process.
Understood. I mean, I think for this plan examination, obviously it was submitted at the end of October, and that's the point at which the council said we've got everything, and we think we're going to submit a sound plan. In an ideal world, if all councils could do this, you know, the evidence base would be reasonably close to that being produced at that kind of point of submission. I mean, it's very difficult. Councils have got to do, you know, an inordinate amount of work to support local plans, and sometimes there will invariably be a bit of a gap between when a piece of technical evidence has been done. We'll have to take a view as to whether there's too much of a gap in some areas and that needs to be updated, or whether actually no, it's of that time, but it's still good and it still supports the plan that was submitted. So yeah, we're not looking at this stage really for kind of too much to be sort of working on sort of shifting sands too much, unless, you know, obviously we come to a view that things need to be revisited. So, Mr. Gentleman, thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to come back and be a little bit more specific. So obviously the discussion of viability within the SHLAR 2022, 5.5 discusses the assessment availability, and 5.50 and 5.51 specifically aspects of achievability. And it mentions in here at 5.51 any factors that may affect the potential site coming forward, including cost of development, market factors and delivery factors. These are specific points of viability which I don't believe have been considered in full with the allocations that we see before us. So I just wanted to really sort of hone down on that to try and thank you.
Thank you. Is there anything further you wanted to say in your previous answer, I think, on this point, Mr. Brewer?
Nothing specific to add really, and that was the part of the SHLAR I was referring to, and it was that kind of judgment around viability at that stage of the process, and say that's one part of it. Viability assessment is another. The planning judgment around which site allocations to take forward is another. So I'm sure we'll have further discussions on different issues of that through different sessions.
Yeah, I think I want to have the viability discussion next week to kind of inform my wider picture on this point. Yeah, thank you. I've made a note of that particular paragraph of the SHLAR. I'm going to move on in terms of the agenda because we've still got a reasonable amount to cover this morning. We'll start into part of item 2 on the agenda, and then we'll probably have a mid-morning break. So, having undertaken the strategic housing land availability assessment, I think it was indicated earlier, a number of sites migrate through that and are deemed to be deliverable or developable. My assumption would be they then go into this sustainability appraisal process. I think, Mr. Brewer, you indicated there may have been other sites that didn't go through the SHLAR process. That no.
Vic, sorry, but it's my fault for not being clear, and we'll probably pick it up in our answer when you finish. So all of the sites that went through the SHLAR process, obviously some of them that came out as deliverable and developable in the 2022. Were obviously covered it off in the ISA work, but obviously some of those that were in Appendix 3 of the SHLAR had also been picked up in the ISA work. So I was just trying to make the point that all of the sites that went through the SHLAR process had also been through the SA process as well, whether they were Appendix 3, 4, 5, because the different iterations of the ISA we've had.
Oh, I see. So all of the sites have also been through the sustainability appraisal process at some point. Yeah, we'll probably come into that, and it might put me right on my the way I was reading it was there's been a wider assessment, then things have kind of narrowed down to a smaller kind of pool of sites, around about 150 that had gone through the sustainability appraisal process. So it wasn't I'm probably making this a lot more complicated than it needs to be. So is this Mr. Mills? So were all the original 400 sort of pushed through this SA process, or just a smaller refined kind of pool of kind of reasonable options?
Yes, a threshold was applied, which might want to be discussed here, of the sites that were then considered from the SHLAR and assessed through the sustainability appraisal, and that was applying that all sites less than 10 units were taken out. They weren't carried through.
So if I do some rudimentary maths, so there were 400 originally, when you discount out sites of less than 10, you're then left with roughly about 150.
I think about 148, it's around that. So, yeah.
Sites that are above 10 that were considered through the SHLAR process, and then further looked at in detail through the sustainability appraisal process. So it's the 10 is the threshold at that stage. There wasn't a case that any sites, so looking at the other end of the spectrum, you didn't apply a kind of a cut-off point if sites were too big. So there's no sort of, it was really just if they were below 10, they kind of filtered out. Yeah. And in terms of those sites, of those around about 148 sites, so they were all considered. I think they're all in the integrated sustainability appraisal that accompanies the Regulation 19 plan. So we go to towards the end of that very large document, kind of got all the site plans. All the sites have been sort of looked at against the sustainability objectives.
Yes, sir. So all those sites have been assessed, but the SA itself, the sustainability appraisal itself, didn't make the site selection. It just assessed the performance of the sites and then informed the next stages of the process.
I understand. So it kind of just fairly looked at them. I think you say in the sustainability appraisal, no site comes out completely kind of unscathed. There's some tension with one or more of the sustainability objectives, but as you say, it's not a case then if you say, well, that part of the document, these are then the preferred sites that will deliver our strategy. That's then done in a separate exercise in terms of the paper B.
That's correct, sir. So probably the primary part of the sustainability appraisal in terms of then refining it was actually identifying the preferred spatial strategy, which was then used as the tool taken forward in paper B to then filter out the sites. But all the sites that had come through the SHLAR applying that 10 unit threshold were assessed, and then the sites that had been identified to be allocated, the appendix in the plan, the site specific requirements had been performed by the SA, but that's obviously for the ones that are being allocated.
So this could perhaps be anticipated. So no sites perform so poorly in terms of sustainability objectives that they kind of get sieved out through the sustainability appraisal process. But as you say, it through that exercise, you then start to identify some of the issues that might need to be in the site-specific requirements in terms to mitigate?
Yes, sir,
Some of that.
because the previous exercise of the SHLA had already done that complete, definitive, not acceptable. So the SA process was more about how the sites performed individually and whether or not they needed, if they would require further mitigation for them to perform to their maximum in terms of being sustainable if they were taken forward as an allocation.
And then it's stepping away from the sustainability appraisal, then into paper B, where we can then get from the 148 potentially reasonable sites to I think it's the 41 sites that then go through the further filtering stage in paper B. Is that the next step of the journey for sites?
Yeah, that's correct. So it's probably the key part in terms of that. Then really determining filtering process. It wasn't just informed by the sustainability appraisal process. So there were kind of, I think, 4 key themes from the sustainability appraisal in terms of implementing a spatial strategy. But there are also similar themes that had been identified through the previous round of consultation on the draft plan that we felt was important to make sure that they were delivered. So then they helped develop 5 filters, if you like, or reasons for removing sites, which this, rather than going through in detail, but they are listed in HO 17, Appendix 1. So there's a table that starts R1 to 5. Those have been directly derived from so again on paper BHO 17, so paragraph 217, and then paragraph 3.1 explains those 2 different sources that I helped identify those reasons, those filter mechanisms.
Thank you. And in terms of those filters within paper B, obviously they're a reflection of the preferred approach within the plan itself. So again, we're coming to the issue of if you're outside style at the top. So yes, again, if you're too small for what you want to allocate in the island planning strategy, you'll get kind of caught by reason 1, if you're less than 10 units. If you're outside of any primary, secondary or rural service centre boundary. So in terms of that reason 2, is that, what boundary is that? Is that the core strategy boundary or the boundary that would evolve or adjust to include the sites within the island plan strategy?
The boundaries in the IPS.
Okay, so how would you determine that before sieving sites that would then go to make your new boundary or amended boundary?
It's because this is not the first stage in the process. So obviously we'd already had that package of proposed allocations in the first Reg 18 version of the plan. So effectively we weren't starting from afresh. We'd always obviously been through a package of allocation. Obviously we were looking at which of those sites were sitting outside of settlement boundaries, existing proposed settlement boundaries.
I see. So it reflected some continuation of proposed allocations and obviously sites that may have subsequently got planning permission from the first stroke second regulation 18. So even though they've gone back into the SLAR process and been reconsidered, you still took them as a basis from which to kind of sieve further sites. So, okay.
Yeah, so effectively, you know, obviously we had a package of sites that formed our proposed allocations in that first regulation 18 plan. And obviously that was a package of sites that looked to deliver the level of growth that we were planning for in that plan. Obviously that level of growth reduced into the second. So there was effectively this filtering process of sites. So a number of those proposed allocations effectively came out of the plan, and that's the kind of application of these reasons to do that. So when we're looking at which sites to take out, these were the reasons we applied to those to take out. So we're effectively using that kind of Reg 18, the first Reg 18 plan as the starting point, if you like, for then applying this kind of filtering process, if that makes sense.
So if you weren't, not that we're really sort of looking at emission sites, but just the process. So if you weren't retained and carried forward as a Reg 18 site, then you looked at again through this process and filter R2, you'd be knocked out by virtue of being outside of the boundary. There was sort of no way back.
So there's nowhere back, but obviously at this point we were looking at what spatial, you know, we're taking into account the spatial strategy of the plan in trying to achieve that level of growth as well. So, you know, when we're looking at which sites to include in the plan to support the level of growth that we're looking to achieve, obviously one of the things we think about is what is our spatial strategy. And so I guess the challenge is we look at these bits in isolation in terms of a process, whereas actually they're kind of all a part of a whole. So we're making these decisions at the same time, rather than going through a very kind of definitive process. So yeah, when we looked back at that package of first allocations, if you were outside of a settlement boundary, then we took the view that from a spatial strategy perspective, if that was a planning judgment we made, that site would be removed.
Then further under reason 5, the fifth kind of filter, coming back to this again, this issue of adjacent site, but then a judgment as to whether you form a logical extension. Clearly a number of sites were filtered out on that basis, including also site specific issues. For some of these, in terms of through this process, and it's including the SLAR, but also potentially through the sustainability appraisal process, did the council consider whether any of these kind of constraints or issues, if there were site specific issues, if there were constraints or matters, the extent to which those could be addressed, either through looking at that as either through the SLAR process or through the subsequent sieving exercise?
And some of that does come down to planning judgment. And, you know, when we redid the SLAR process in 2022, obviously part of that was speaking to some of the promoters of those sites, and some of the information we gathered on some of those sites suggested that deliverability would be an issue. So obviously they may well then fall into that R5, whether that's over the availability of access or things like that. So so there was an element of judgment to make there, but that was informed by the process we've been through in terms of rerunning the SLAR.
Thank you. I mean, obviously the sustainability appraisal process the sustainability appraisal document signposts to paper B. Going back to our discussion on the first day and around sort of sustainability appraisal, what would the council's view be if there was if we were to be thinking along the lines of, well, some of the exercise that's been undertaken in a paper B perhaps ought to be embedded within the sustainability appraisal in terms of this is how we got to our preferred approach and our preferred sites rather than through a separate paper or exercise. That was our ultimate conclusion on this.
I think our view would be that the purpose of the SA is to consider a wider package, and that forms part of the evidence base that then assists us moving through that plan making process. And when we're talking about site selection, the SA, it's not the role of the SA to select sites for allocation. The SA is a piece of evidence that helps us inform that decision to make through plan making. So, the SA is a step in the process. The paper B work we've done almost follows on that step, because we're looking at what sites we're selecting to be proposed to allocate in the plan. So they've been through SLAR, they've been through SA, and then the next step for us as plan makers is then to pick a package of sites that align with the spatial strategy that we're moving forward with. So I think, our view is that all of the sites have been through SLAR, they've been through SA, and that's correct. But then it's down to the plan makers and using their planning judgment to select those allocations to go forward into the plan, and that's the process we've been through.
And ultimately, they do go back into the SA in terms of at a high level. I think there's various tables that kind of show what the allocations, what the ultimate allocations, how they perform at a high level against the sustainability objectives. I think it's probably still an area I want to sort of think on a bit further, just from a sort of procedural assurance, safety point of view. I mean, it's all plans are different. I have seen it the other way, where sustainability appraisal will take you through the narrative of why a particular approach or particular set of sites was identified, rather than specifically signposting you to another document. Presumably the paper B was available at the time of the Regulation 19 exercise. Yeah.
So if it would help, we would be happy to prepare almost a kind of chronology list of the different documents and the stages and the timelines of that, just so you can see perhaps easy in a flow chart, if you like, of the process that can be followed, if that would assist in your thinking on that topic.
I think so. It goes back to the point that we touched on Tuesday, that so far as simply the regulatory requirements are concerned, the issue is, has the council carried out something that can be described as a sustainability appraisal, which includes strategic environmental assessment? As to, I say that phrase I used, the quality of the address, the way in which it's done that doesn't go to regulatory compliance. It may cross over into soundness issues. So as it were, the planning judgments that are made and the question as to whether or not you are satisfied that the resulting output is sound, that's in a sense in your territory, but it's not an issue of regulatory compliance, so long as you are satisfied that the council has done a sustainability appraisal. It's not such because so much of sustainability appraisal does involve planning judgments, and the plan maker is the person who is entitled to make those planning judgments from a regulatory point of view. It's not as if you sit, as it were, like as a kind of a mini judicial review on those planning judgments, because that's not your function. Your function is to simply ask yourself the question, have they complied with the regulatory compliance matters? If they have, in a sense, it's almost like park that. But then the soundness questions, which are for you to exercise having regard to the soundness tests in the MPPF, that's where you can bring your planning judgments to bear on those things. I mean, I know it's a little bit of a, sounds legalistic, but I think it is quite important to be distinct between what is a matter of regulatory compliance. Have they done what they need to do simply to satisfy the requirements of the 2004 regulations and section 19(1)(a) of the 2004 Act in relation to sustainability appraisal? And that is, I say, those are in a sense relatively low bars, because to achieve that regulatory compliance, the court is not interested when it comes to consider things in, I say, this quality of address, the way it's been done. The court is only interested in, were those planning judgments within the frame of reasonableness, i.e. not so unreasonable that a planning judgment could not have been made in that way. If that's been done, that's as much as needs to be done to meet regulatory compliance. But soundness is a different issue, and that is just straightforward planning judgment for you looking at the tests in paragraph 35 of the NPPF. And then, in a sense, if we want some further assurance as to these matters, insofar as there are to be main modifications, and I suppose it's no secret to say that we don't think that there's ever been a plan that deals with what might be called main topics as opposed to AAPs and things. There's never been a plan that has not required main modifications and has been then adopted. So inevitably, we will have to produce a further environmental report in relation to any main modifications, which will have to consider how do they impact on the other things in the plan. And then obviously that is the subject of further consultation, and obviously you get to see the results of that. So there is, in a sense, there is a further check on matters, but I think we'd just be a little bit concerned that we don't think that you, as it were, need to get into the detailed gubbins of the SA in order to satisfy yourselves that there's been regulatory compliance. When you get into these kind of matters, they're more dealing with the planning judgment and the soundness issues. And you will, of course, be very well aware that so far as that soundness test in relation to where it covers the SA ground, there was that refinement to the NPPF. I think it was in 2018, but the refinement that made it clear that what you're interested in is simply, has the plan maker put forward what is an appropriate strategy, and the emphasis being an appropriate strategy, given reasonable alternatives. It doesn't actually matter that there might be other strategies which either might be also appropriate, or indeed somebody might say, well, that one would have been a better one. That it's not necessary to go that far in order to find a plan sound. It's only necessary to know that there was, in your view, that you're satisfied it is an appropriate way. And that, again, in a sense, slightly reflects the fact that with many of these areas, because there are so many planning judgments, there's not necessarily a right or a wrong answer. There are just a spectrum of perfectly acceptable ways of dealing with things, some of which some people might say are better than others, but we're not trying to get a perfect plan, we're trying to get a sound plan. And I'm probably labouring the point, but I just be concerned that we don't go too far into some of the detail where matters of planning judgment are made by the local authority to achieve regulatory compliance, and that's as far as they need to do.
Thank you. I'll try and rein in my cautiousness around sustainability appraisal. It has been a rich theme for legal challenge, and I'd like to be in a position when finding a plan sound around legal compliance with SA to make sure we're not creating any kind of further risk for a local authority. Obviously, I've got further kind of due diligence to do in relation to these submitted regulation 18 sustainability appraisals that the council brought to my attention on the first day and indeed before then. I think I would like to take up Mr. Brewer's offer of some sort of very brief kind of chronology paper to perhaps can, make things fit or fix clearer in my mind as to kind of what was done when, and that will help inform my view. And if I'm reading that, I've got any further clarifications I want from the council, I can obviously do that in writing through the programme officer, and that'll be transparent for everybody to see. I'm mindful it's just gone 11:30. I'd quite like to take a mid-morning break. Others may do too. You might hopefully be tea or coffee outside in the foyer area. It's just gone 11:30. If we can be back in this room at 11:45, please, and then we'll resume discussion. Thank you. Okay, apologies for the slight delay, having to deal with something that's arisen. It's now just come up to 5 to 12, so I'm going to resume this session in relation to matter 6. I do not have any further points or issues I wanted to raise under item 2 of the agenda, but before I move away from that into other related issues, anything people wish to say in relation to the sustainability appraisal process that followed on from the SHLA note? Just on reflection, Mr. Brewer, in terms of the offer of a sort of a chronological paper, to provide a sort of a time frame for that. So we're sitting next week, so the week after. I was thinking of being generous around about the 19th of March. But if you can do it any sooner,
We'll do it as soon as we possibly can and get it to you, and I suspect it will be well before that.
thank you very much. Obviously, clearly don't have the art of the deal in terms of setting parameters. Okay. In terms of moving on then to item 3, and I think this does come under part of the discussion we had yesterday around the spatial strategy, and it relates to our matters and issues questions 6.2 and the position the council's putting forward that this should be seen as a minimum housing requirement, and that there's some flexibility within the plan to kind of deliver above and beyond that 453 figure, is whether some of the sites that have been filtered out through the combination of the SHLA and the sustainability appraisal process could possibly come forward through other policies of the plan. And obviously, the council's not beholden to this, but it's done an analysis through paper B in terms of where it thinks sites possibly could come forward under policies H7, which is the rural exception sites policy, or H9 in terms of previously developed land subject to various criteria. And there do seem to be a number of sites where the council's ticked the box. I appreciate that's not a precursor to you definitely will get a planning consent. In terms of that approach, obviously it's not similar to core strategy policy SP1. I mean, would it be fair to say in terms of the reasonableness of that approach that the yield would be relatively modest through that approach, or could cumulatively it add up, and presumably it would be accounted for within the windfall rate that the council's already identified?
Thank you, sir. And yeah, that was going to be my starting point, is obviously part of the supply that we identify is windfall, 100 dwellings a year across the plan period. So that windfall, as we discussed yesterday and touched on, will be made up of different facets and different locations and different types of development. Some will be within settlement boundaries, and some, as we've identified, could potentially be outside of settlement boundaries through the applications of policy H7 and H9. I think we included that table in paper B almost as a bit of a guide, really, just to demonstrate how those policies may work in practice and what sites might be caught by them. So that was the purpose of doing that. It doesn't go anything beyond that. It was very much just an indication of which sites that were previously allocated in the first Reg 18 plan maybe potentially able to come forward under those policies. So, from our perspective, we've identified a clear windfall supply through the plan period. We expect that to come from various different sources, and part of those sources would be and maybe H7 and H9. As we again touched on yesterday, I suspect the scale of some of those will be proportionate to those locations where they're coming forward. And again, that's referenced in both of those policies as well, in terms of exception sites policies and previously developed land. Obviously, that's going to depend on the scale of the land which is being developed. So, it's difficult to give any kind of steer on what that yield may be. But I think, from our perspective, that forms a reasonable basis of where some of that windfall could be generated from.
Thank you. So I think from the council's perspective, you'd invite us to say it's not necessarily the end of the road for some of these sites that have been discounted. There may be, subject to details, subject to how precisely they come forward, opportunities under other policies of the plan.
Yeah, absolutely correct. And I think that chimes with kind of some of the conversations we've been having so far this morning and yesterday or today around land supply. Obviously, the recognition that the housing requirement, for all the reasons we've set out, is what it is in the plan. But in line with national guidance, it's not a target. It's not something you aim for and then don't go beyond. It is a figure that can be exceeded. And so this is one of the ways that could occur.
Thank you. Obviously, we'll come on to look at those specific policies and their mechanics next week. But Mr. Long, is there anything further you wish to say in relation to this in follow-up to yesterday's discussion?
I'll bring it in next week, I think, in H9 terms. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, obviously, we've got the council's answer to our MIQ 6.2, and we'll have a look again at that paper B in terms of that approach. I'll move on then to item 4 of the agenda, and again, this come back to an aspect of the site selection process, and in relation specifically to flood risk, as we identified earlier through the strategic housing land availability assessment. The indication was that this was kind of dealt with at a relatively high or initial level if sites were in the higher flood risk zones, zone 2 and zone 3, as a way of initially filtering out some sites, but there has been some discretion in terms of kind of exceptional circumstances to that. And looking at the council's evidence, I think originally around about sort of 5 potential sites kind of rubbed up against kind of a higher level of flood risk. We're going to come on to a site this afternoon where it's obviously a significant issue, and we've obviously got the statement of common ground now with the Environment Agency. But in terms of that overall sequential kind of approach of, in the first instance, avoiding where possible areas of high flood risk, how's the council gone about that process?
Be passing across to my colleague Mr. Mills in a second, but I think just as a starting point, obviously we're all very familiar with the island, but obviously respect the fact that obviously you may not be. So a really important point to start with when considering this issue is that all of our major settlements are at some point on the water, because they're on the coast. We think about Ryde, Cowes, Newport, so all our main settlements are adjacent to water. So in terms of our ability to search for dry land, if you like, which is in sustainable locations close to existing settlements, that can be a challenge for us on the island, but notwithstanding the approach we've taken. But I'll pass on to Mr. Mills to explain a bit more of the detail on the approach we've taken.
Thank you, Mr. Burrett. So I think it's worth pointing out that, and you'll see from the Statement of Common Ground, ED 12 with the Environment Agency, we have done some significant work to address their concerns, and their concerns are of a technical nature in terms of the detail in the SFRA level 2, the site summary sheets, not with regards to the application of the sequential approach or sequential test. That being said, we did identify some sites that we would have to take through the exceptions test simply because of their otherwise performance in terms of sustainability and applying the spatial strategy. So those sites were in the primary settlements, brownfield sites. Again, referring to the Statement of Common Ground, there has been further works that provides an update including the removal of one of those sites. Because of the updated work, we felt it was appropriate to take that site out.
If maybe where local pronunciation gets the better of me, is it Thetis Road in Cowes? So that would be a potentially
Yes,
proposed
so
modification.
the original site summary sheet did allow part of that site to be developed relatively safely within flood zone 1, but having applied the climate change uplifts, looking over the plan period, or the lifetime of the development, sorry, we couldn't there wasn't any of the site left really to be able to deliver that. That combined with the relatively small potential yield of the site, and therefore its significance, because we have looked at the implications of taking the site out, meant that it was probably more sensible to take that site out. So.
And in terms of the sort of stepping back to the general application of the sequential approach and the council's reasonings or its views on why the approach it's taking is considered to be consistent with national planning policy. I mean, the starting point is obviously where possible to avoid these areas of higher flood risk. We've obviously got various paragraphs of the MPPF, in particular paragraphs 168 and 169. 168 seems reasonably clear in terms of the avoidance point. In terms of the council's submissions around the kind of the sustainability benefits, or the sustainability sustainability benefits of making a sort of an exception to that sequential test in terms of development going into areas of a higher flood risk. Can that be concluded that that's consistent with both paragraphs 168 and 169, the National Planning Policy Framework?
We feel it can, sir, and it's evidenced in paper B with regards to, I know we're going to get onto it later, but Newport Harbour, which is probably you'll appreciate from the statement of common grounds the remaining point in that we perhaps can't reach agreement with the Environment Agency.
Just add I think our response to MIQ 6.3 provides some of the commentary around that, and I think probably the kind of second and third paragraphs begin to talk around that kind of judgment exercise we've had to make. And as I started off this item by saying, you know, the site in question, which we'll touch on later, is a brownfield site in the centre of the county town in public sector ownership. So, you know, from our perspective of trying to secure sustainable development, yes, there is an issue of flood risk on that site, but obviously just ignoring it because of that brings into other issues around sustainability and then, you know, not being able to provide potential homes in a particular area, which is in a really sustainable location. So I think our 6.3 is probably where we direct you to some of that additional commentary.
Thank you. And for the sort of the alternative approach of, well, no, we'll apply a very, you know, rigid sequential test, we'll avoid areas of higher flood risk. That was sort of deemed to be necessary for an appropriate strategy. What would be the consequences for the spatial strategy that the plan's putting forward? appreciate maybe slightly stray into this afternoon's discussion, but is
I think I guess the point there is the word balance, isn't it? I think, and as much as we're looking to, secure development in the right place, the point you're making there is that, if we did take that hard line, then the potential is that we're then ignoring sites in extremely sustainable locations that may still be able to be developed and be safe over their life, which is obviously the key point. And we may then be looking further afield for sites which perhaps don't align with the spatial strategy that we're looking to take forward in this plan. So I think that's the balancing exercise for us that we have to carry out when thinking about that particular topic.
So just to add to that, so the point of the level 2 is then to provide the certainty that the sites can be delivered safely, and therefore to try and, as far as possible, de-risk it. So because that's what developers need, is certainty that. So if we just left the site, the level of risk, the potential for any of those kind of sites to come forward, I would suggest would be far greater. So it's trying to recognise and acknowledge those sites and their context within the spatial strategy and their significance, particularly as we're an island.
But in terms of all other potential sites that were put forward within flood zones 2 and 3, they were sieved out as part of the initial SLAR process. Notwithstanding, there are kind of sort of put the Cal site to one side, because that appears to kind of be a different point now in terms of where you are with the Environment Agency. The other 2 or 3 sites, you're looking to just focus on the developable area on the flood zone 1 parts of those sites. So other than the site we're going to talk about this afternoon, anything else that was put forward in zones 2 and 3 has kind of been filtered out against your approach in the SLAR.
It has, sir, and but in certain instances, we had the opportunity to revise site boundaries to exclude areas of flood risk, but we made the decision not to, because that would mean that it would disregard, for example, the water course, which means then that we wouldn't be able to apply certain policies in terms of respecting the water course and getting environmental gain from that. A good example is the Silken Drive site. I can't remember the reference for it, but all of the development can be safely accommodated within flood zone 1, but being able to treat the site in its entirety means you get a good amount of planning gain as well, sir.
Thank you. So on the flood risk issue, Councillor Jarman.
Yes, sir, thank you. I think it's very difficult when we're doing these assessments and looking at these allocations to separate the issues of coastal erosion, flooding, drainage, and indeed land stability. We all know as islanders that they're intrinsically linked, that not all flooding comes from the sea. Some of it comes from the inability of water flow to come off the land and go into the sea. And some of the issues that are caused by drainage and by flooding on the land result in that permeating through to the slipper layers, which cause land heaves. And I think we're all familiar with the stories of that on the island in more recent past. So I'd suggest that when we're looking at the criteria by which sites are allocated, all 4 of those key factors need to be addressed almost concurrently when looking at a site. And it can be very difficult. I appreciate the difficulty that officers are faced with here in ascertaining the potential of a site when we don't necessarily know the underlying strata within that site, or indeed some cases where the water courses actually will flow through that site. And we've had a number of examples of that recently, different points around the island. Some which have caused accelerated coastal erosion at Shepherd's Chine, for example, some of which have caused permutation issues down through the layers we're all familiar with in Leeson Road and through Ventnor. And of course, the good news is we do have more data for that based on the bore sites that are coming forward and the recent Environment Agency redrafting of coastal erosion projections around the island. So one of the issues I would cite is in taking into account sites, I think the accelerated rate of coastal erosion needs to be reflected in a plan so that we may well find that sites which previously might have been thought suitable and immune to those measures may in the future, and indeed now, need to be reconsidered because of the accelerated erosion, the additional rainfall, the new discovery of watercourses and the impact of that which is happening. So some flexibility is needed in the plan. And this may come back to what my colleague was talking earlier, where sites need to be, we need to have sufficient sites so that those which become not viable in the future can be substituted with other sites that could become viable by the new data. And clearly, if we have a better idea of the drainage and underground flooding of a particular site and therefore its capacity for heave, if we're able to discount that possibility, that may bring a site into the consideration. And if we discover through bore testing and others sites which are at greater risk, they may need to be removed from that plan. So I think the need for flexibility is quite key here.
Is council able to advise? I mean, obviously the SHLA refers to flood zones 2 and 3 in terms of some of, obviously there are other sources of flooding, etc. Ground stability issues. I think you mentioned at least one of those, Mr. Brewer, when we started the discussion on SHLA this morning. So assurance that those other factors have been taken into account.
Yeah, thank you, sir. And some really good points raised by Councillor Jarman, and absolutely, it's sometimes quite a complex jigsaw puzzle when you're dealing with water and all the sources of water and where water goes. But as I said earlier, the rerun of the SHLA in 2022 added a kind of discounting stage that picked up coastal change management areas and ground instability as well. So they were some of kind of the key characteristics that we looked at when we're thinking about the suitability of sites. And we also have policies EV16 and EV17 in the plan, which deal directly with those two issues as well. So, and a policy layer, certainly when it comes to the coastal change management areas, which looks to obviously steer development away from those areas because of all the issues that Councillor Jarman so rightly put out in terms of the impacts that may have. So from a policy perspective, we're covered off, and I think there's a distinction here between plan making and decision making as well. And obviously from a plan making perspective, there is a degree of detail we can get into, but a lot of that detail often comes out at that decision-making stage because a number of factors that Councillor Jarman raised in terms of water courses, where water is going to go from that development, you don't necessarily know at the plan-making stage. So I think from a policy perspective, we have the robust content in that plan to deal with those issues and have considered it through the selection process we've been through as well.
Thank you. And then just finally on flood risk, I'm going to come back to this issue of, obviously the council directs us to paragraphs 168, 169 of the December 2003 MPPF. I think really kind of in particular to paragraph 169, where it starts with, if it's not possible for development to be located in areas with a lower risk of flooding, brackets taking into account wider sustainable development objectives, then you start to move into the exception test. Should that be read as if there are not kind of suitable and available sites within the lower flood risk zone 1, that aren't perhaps caught by other considerations that may be kind of things like national landscape or green belt or other factors that may apply? That's the way to look at it, rather than, well, we've got a site that we think will fit or will perform well in terms of other wider sustainability objectives. If you've got, through the SHLA and the sustainability appraisal process, an amount of land within lower flood risk areas that's going to deliver your development quantums in a way that could comprise a an appropriate strategy, a sustainable strategy, that's where you go first, rather than a site that may have a number of benefits and advantages, but is caught by virtue of being within an area of higher flood risk. And that, to look at it the other way round.
I think, well, we've tried to set out what we think is the position in those paragraphs that follow on from our response to question 6.3. I think we would say that in reading those paragraphs of the MPPF, you should also obviously take into account that part of the planning practice guidance that we've also referred to. And I think we would be cautious about, in a sense, elevating the guidance on the sequential approach into a kind of a mechanistic, as it were, tool, which is a blunt instrument. We say that you have to read that as a whole. And it's quite clear, we would say, that when you read 168 and 169 together with the further explanation in the MPPF, that compatibility with sustainability objectives is part and parcel of applying the sequential approach, that you don't, in a sense, park those other issues and just focus on which zone is it in, and then immediately move to the exception test. What you do is you bring those wider sustainability objectives into account when you are reviewing sites which may be in zones 2 or 3, and then depending on what you conclude about those, then you may then move forward. So I think I said we try to explain what we think is the approach in our response.
No, this is one of my few opportunities to kind of just test a bit further and just probe that. So thank you for that. In terms of flood risk and just the site selection process, anything further people wish to raise in terms of the council's approach? We'll come on to the flood risk policies in due course and specific site this afternoon. Just reflecting those small number of Reg 19 reps from people who say, obviously we've got a site within flood zone 1 and that should have been considered in advance of any sites in higher flood risk areas. Okay. Going to move on then in terms of the agenda then, please. And item 5, we've kind of touched on this, I think, already this morning as part of the discussion on the SHLA in terms of certainly the ancient woodland policy. We'll also come on, obviously, next week as part of the environmental policies, the consideration of the kind of the settlement gap approach. But we would probably just raise here whether there's kind of any kind of consistency issue between what the council is seeking to do through policies like EV10 and what it's seeking to achieve through the various sites that it's putting forward, some of which I think when you look back at the coalescence study, whether they be sites that came from the regulation 18 stage, are in areas that were identified through the LUC work back in 2018, and whether there's a kind of consistency of approach, how the council looked at that. So just in follow up to that, to Mr. Brewer, so the council in looking at site selection process didn't sort of, did it apply or did not apply sort of a kind of like, well, we've got kind of strategic gaps and that would be an immediate kind of discount or a reason for discounting sites. I'm not sure if that was the approach, but maybe you can assist us on that.
Yeah, thank you, sir. And yeah, we touched on I guess the ancient woodland point this morning, and I think from a settlement gap perspective, that is obviously a kind of policy on, we use the phraseology we picked up on earlier, approach. So, you know, the evidence base around the coalescent study and the settlement gaps obviously is a snapshot in that time. I think that it's a material consideration when we're looking at those kind of that planning judgment of which sites to take forward and not. It's not a definitive no, because otherwise you'd never be able to expand anywhere. And I think that's an important point when we're looking at planning for a level of growth on the island. That kind of implicit implied, that there is additional development that's going to come forward as a result of that. It cannot all be accommodated within existing assessment boundaries. That again, the evidence base demonstrates that for the level of requirement we're planning for. So, yeah, that there is an element of planning judgment to the application of that through the plan making process. And that's how we've applied that. And again, we'll come on to the specific policy, probably on the assessment gaps next week in more detail, but from a general perspective, that's how we've run it.
Thank you. And I think as part of that discussion, we'll pick up, I think the council wants to put forward a modification, I think, to make clear the distinction between kind of in principle matters and kind of issues that will be of more detail at the development management process, which may assist some of the concerns people have around how this is all going to potentially hang together. Mr. Long, please.
Thank you, sir. I'll try not to stray into too much detail if we're going to cover some bits in environment policy or the specific housing policies, but just in terms of on a yield basis, the question raised and it brought up in representation. So we have policy H2, and you've raised part D correctly about all other relevant policy requirements, which refers to H3 on the yield site selection process. I'm continually drawn to the thresholds of sites of more than 75 dwellings, which is a reasonable proportion of the allocations at that kind of yield, and the requirement to bring forward SANG under the SANG metric that Natural England used, for instance, having a 5.6 kilometre area to walk around in a circle. The yield basis of the sites that are in allocation, you're not going to get the yield out of the numbers if you have the SANG. It's virtually impossible. The only site that doesn't have the SANG requirement is KPS2 of the Newport Harbour. The granularity of that policy can be discussed, but I'm just saying on a site selection process, if you look at yield and number, you're just not going to achieve the numbers that the plan sets out if you have that policy.
Thank you. I turn to the council. I mean, it's probably a cumulative issue. I think that's what we're trying to sort of grapple with under item 5 of the agenda, and start to sort of layer up the various things that would be triggered through policy HD2 in terms of other requirements of the plan, start turning to policy H3. Then we've got to look at, for some sites, the specific requirements in appendix 3. When you start layering this all together, it is related to the site selection process. The kind of the yields that you've identified through the SHLA and presumably kind of tested and looked at in a bit more detail, whether when you start adding this all together, kind of the confidence that the sites where they have been proposed and allocated in the plan are going to deliver kind of sensible densities or appropriate densities for that particular part of the island, and achieve everything else that the council perhaps wants to see from these specific sites, potentially other windfall sites if they come forward.
I think the short answer is yes, that has formed part of our consideration, and I think the SANG issue is a really interesting one because it's not a definitive. It is a very site specific issue, and conversations with Natural England reflect that. And certainly on some of the sites that have come forward recently of above the size that Mr. Long referenced to, some will provide on-site SANG, some won't, and so it is there is a decision there that hasn't been made yet in terms of some of those sites. And I think that again, when we're looking at yields at the plan making stage, there is an element of kind of judgment on that to be made by the LPA. Some of that comes through from the amount of yield that developers themselves are promoting on those sites and what they think is realistic. Sometimes we may agree with that. Sometimes we may take a slightly more conservative estimate. Other times we may take a more bullish estimate. So it has formed part of the consideration. I'll take the point entirely around the policies working together and making sure that we're not tripping ourselves up in terms of some of the requirements of that. But that has formed part of the kind of consideration of the plan making process. And we're confident as we can be at this plan making stage that the policy requirements on those sites, and certainly when you get into Appendix 3 and some of the site-specific requirements, which we no doubt come on to as we talk about specific sites so in future hearing sessions, can be achieved and still deliver the policy requirements of the plan, because many of those policy requirements are picked up in those site-specific requirements as well.
So should we, so for bringing other people, so should we be looking back at the SLAR in terms of that assessment and testing of the kind of reasonableness of yield from particular sites? Is that the kind of key piece of evidence?
Yes, it is. Yeah, so the two SLARs that we've run obviously consider the potential yield of a site, looking at all of the potential constraints and opportunities that those sites may offer. And sorry, just to finish off, and obviously that's the starting point of the process. As we've discussed earlier, that's a kind of piece of technical evidence which we then take as plan makers and say, okay, well, the SLAR considered this. We've also got to consider this, and that may affect the yield either positively or negatively when we propose the allocation in the plan.
Thank you. So just so sort of labour this point. So in terms of take the SLAR and they say through plan making, is that process captured anywhere in terms of testing site capacity, say through various kind of judgments? Or as I say, we really got to kind of look at the SLAR as a kind of source evidence to be. Does that kind of give us? Yeah, sorry, I'll leave it at, yeah, we're really looking at the SLAR as that really in terms of the written material. Okay. Thank you. We'll do that after these hearing sessions. If there's anything further we need, we'll seek that from the council. Before I move on to Mr. Gentleman, Mr. Long.
Just a point of clarification. So, I don't want to make it a SANG-centric discussion at the moment, but is that, sorry, just for point of clarification, is the SANG and housing, is that going to come under environment?
I'm boldly saying yes. I ought to just confer with my colleague Sam.
Comes in at some point.
Yes, yes.
I've definitely got it on my notes. It was on the agenda for Tuesday afternoon, I think.
Mr. Gentleman, please.
Thanks. I appreciate this is likely to come under environmental as well, but biodiversity net gain of 10% and the effect of that policy on yield is very significant. Certainly work that David and I have done together on sites, and you look at the land take that requires, that again seriously damages the yield of a site. All of this points back to earlier points that have been made in that in order for this as a policy document to be successful, we should be over allocating and taking that same approach that we took with employment land. That, you know, if we've got, if we're looking at what the need base is, granted this policy document doesn't follow need, we should be looking at over allocation to make sure that we're protected for those things that fall out or those other problems that we encounter with SANG, with biodiversity net gain. And a lot of that work is very difficult to quantify until you really get into the granular site specifics. You know, there are other problems today with building regulations in terms of overheating and properties aspect and where you might place a property and where you might not place a property and how that affects yield too. And that is even more complex. Because until you get to site-specific design, you really can't understand that. But again, all of these things point back to that overaching point that we really should be over-allocating because of these big uncertainties that are incredibly difficult for policymakers to try and determine and understand. Thank you.
Thank you. I think again, we've got environment policies to come to next week. I mean, just in terms of coming back to chronology, and just thinking through the timeline for biodiversity net gain, was that something the council kind of first put forward in the Reg 19 plan, or had you foreshadowed that at second Reg 18? Can you recall, Mr. Brewer?
I think from memory, we did mention it in the second Reg 18 because it was kind of in the ether, if you like, of coming out of the Environment Act, but it didn't formulate into the policy wording we've got until the Reg 19 stage. And even then, obviously the date last year of it becoming mandatory was in and around the time the submission plan got approved. So as Mr. Gentleman quite rightly pointed out, it is still a very emerging topic. It's a difficult one for policymakers, absolutely, because there are different ways of addressing BNG, which we'll come on to next week. So yeah, it'll be an interesting conversation when we have that policy next week.
Thank you. Moving on then to agenda item 6, please. Back to an old hobby horse I had on day one of the this examination, and it's obviously the plan sets out. We'll obviously look at the individual site allocations as we move forward, with some overlap when we come to housing land supply on the permissions as well. So obviously policy H2 is the starting point for making the I'm going to call them allocations in the plan, and then we follow that through into sort of appendices 1 and 2, where we've got the large sites with permission, then the allocations. And I think from reading the appendices 2, my interpretation has been some of those sites that are allocated are starting their journey through the planning process. So there'll be a planning application reference number, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's yet a certain outcome at the time that the plan was submitted. So it could have still been subject to 106 or another factor.
Yes, that's correct. So appendices 1 and 2 set out those that kind of sources of supply, if you like, which was large sites with permission and proposed allocations. As ever, as we've discussed on many topics, things change by the day in planning. So some of the sites which have planning permission may have expired. Some of those which were proposed allocations now have permission. So, and I think our updated kind of trajectory and in our Matter 7 hearing statement reflects that. And again, as part of this process, should we go through the main mods process, a factual update to appendices 1 and 2 will obviously be necessary to cover off that issue. And I think I'll just turn to our response to your MOQ 6.4 and the proposed change that we're seeking to make, which is effectively just to move the list of appendices of sites in appendices 1 and 2 into policy H2. So there could be no doubt that these are the sites which we are forming part of the supply for this plan, and obviously all the site-specific requirements will remain in Appendix 3, but just provide that clarity of the list of sites in policy which we're effectively allocating.
From the council's perspective, it'd be your view it would not be necessary for soundness for the plan to be effective to take a similar approach to, say, the employment sites, to have specific sites allocated within the main body of the plan. They're clearly policy rather than in an appendix, in terms of setting requirements, than in an appendix to the plan. I think when we came to sustainability appraisal, your answer was that that's unwieldy, but if it makes for a clearer, more structured document, is that too onerous?
I guess in some ways it's a matter of judgment and clarity on the presentation of a document to a certain extent, isn't it? I think, but I think as we've set out in 6.4, we don't consider it's necessary for soundness, but totally appreciate the point that actually having that list of sites in policy would be beneficial, and I think we would suggest that would probably be the right way to do it. Otherwise, you're lifting what is potentially a kind of 30-40 page appendix into a policy box, which then potentially itself, and I'd take the point around employment allocations, but obviously we only have 6 of those. We've got 25, 30, and all the sites with planning permission as well. So I guess it comes down to a judgment call, but we'd hope by having the list in H2 we can satisfy that.
Thank you. I mean, I think the council's proposed modification of the list is certainly, I would call a minimum. I suppose it's just, again, whether we're being overly cautious and nervous about whether, something being in an appendix has the same kind of stature and status as being quite clearly identified as a policy within the plan.
I mean, well, we did have this discussion obviously earlier in the week about everything, in a sense, inside the front cover and the back cover is part of the plan. But we would be very happy, given obviously it is something that is of concern to you, we would be very happy to look at forms of wording which were very much more clear cut on the status of the appendices, to make it absolutely clear that they function in tandem with the policies and are, I say, we're happy, we can include some general wording in the introductory parts of the plan, for example, to make it clear that each of the policies needs to be read together with any relevant appendix which cross-refers to it, and so on, so as to tie the two together. I mean, slightly going back to, I think, one of your opening remarks on Tuesday, that in a sense, if the plan is sound, it's not relevant that it could be made more sound, because that's not part of the test. And it comes down to then, I think, a judgment about what does the word in para 35 of the MPPF, when it talks about effective, what does it mean, in a sense, what do you need to do to be effective? And in a sense, I suppose different planners might bring different development management experience or scars, as it were, almost to that. And I say there may not be a universality of views as to how far you need to go in order to be effective. And I say what we obviously, because Mr. Brewer is sitting there from one end of the spectrum as to a workable plan. Clearly, you have some concerns about elements of that in terms of wanting it to be clear cut and therefore effective. I say we'd be very happy to look at wording to clarify the role of the appendices and their, as it were, integral importance to the functioning of the policies, if that's a way of I say tying them more, or knitting them more closely into the policies, so as to achieve what I think we're all trying to achieve, which is that those elements are effectively mandatory elements of the policies that they relate to.
Excuse me, I made a note of that kind of suggestion, Mr. Bedford. So yeah, we'll reflect on that further. Mr. Brewer.
Just obviously to mention, we have the policies map as well. So obviously that is very clear in terms of those sites and the site boundaries and the proposed allocation. So as a package of measures.
Thank you. And then I think allied to this, we'd kind of raised a question, I think it was our MIQ 6.7, because we've obviously got requirements in Appendix 3. There are also general housing requirements in Policy H3. Appreciate decision makers have to take the plan as a whole. I think we're just kind of seeking comfort that there's going to be sort of no unintended kind of internal tension between what's in Policy H3 and then site-specific requirements. I think there's a signpost in the supporting text to Policy H3, I think, to just remind people will be specific requirements in Appendix 3. But I think, as the council point out, you have got proposed allocated sites that, for whatever reason, presumably because they're relatively modest, then in turn don't have necessarily site-specific requirements in Appendix 3. So they do need to kind of be considered exclusively in that respect under Policy H3.
Yes, that's right. And I think, our answer to 6.7 sets that out. And I'll probably also add, as we've spoken about this week so far, other sites may come forward. We don't have to look too far within Newport for a vacant site, which you know, at the moment in time, has no prospect of delivery, but could come forward during the plan period. And so if that did come forward, that would then have to come look at H3 in terms of its guiding principles. So again, that's one of the reasons H3 is there, to pick up those kind of sites as well.
And a final question from me for the council. It's slightly left field. It's not on the agenda, so you may not be obliged to answer. But I mean, just from Mr. Bedford referred to SCARs. So the SCARs of a local plan examiner. You go around the country, and most allocated sites or proposed allocated sites generate varying degrees of representation and comment. In respect of this plan, yes, there are some comments, and the council referred to a number of representations, but there are some relatively sizable sites in Appendix 3 that are still allocated that have generated either little or no comment. And I guess the curiosity of a plan examiner kind of kicks in as to whether there's a history to that, but we haven't got our eyes across all of that yet. That explains that they're perhaps to some extent accepted that that's going to be a logical and accepted location for development, or whether the previous regulation 18 exercises kind of flush some of that out to some extent. Combination of the two, or
I think it probably is a combination of those two, and I guess is potentially another point that helps to demonstrate why it's slightly different on the island, and different in sometimes a positive way. And so yeah, that the previous, having done 2 Reg 18s, that obviously gives a lot of opportunity for people to comment and put their thoughts forward. And a number of the sites we've got in the plan are long-standing historic sites that have either been in the planning process for a long time through applications, or have been kind of on the radar for a long time. So I think there is a familiarity, should we say, with a large majority of the sites in the plan, which is potentially a reason for that.
are there any further submissions people wish to make this morning? Well, we're now into this afternoon on the site selection process before I draw this session to a conclusion. No. I'm just going to very briefly check in with the programme officer on something. People can just bear with. Okay, I can conclude for this particular session. I just want to check with the council before we take the lunchtime adjournment, and we'll be reconvening this afternoon for the sites in Newport. Have we got a similar or a curfew today? Is it 4 o'clock?
I don't think we have got a curfew. We'll double check. If it is, it will be 4, but I don't think we have. We'll just double check for you and let you know in the next 5 minutes.
Okay, we may not need to sit for all of that time for Newport, but I'm just mindful that we had a hangover issue from day one, and if time allowed this afternoon, I think as inspectors we'd appreciate to just cover that off before. So we've kind of done everything for week 1, and we're clear to go on week 2. So if time allows after the Newport discussion. Yeah, and other development needs and the separate development plan document. Yep. It shouldn't take too long. Yeah. And I think it's just a discussion with the council. See, the programme officer will be here. So
yeah, no, absolutely more than happy to facilitate that, and we'll just come back to on timings really quick.
Okay. Okay, thank you everybody for your contributions on this session. We're going to reconvene, I think. Sorry, Mr. Brewer.
We are fine to carry on whenever tonight, so there's no curfew. So. Okay.
Thank you. I'll try not to take us too long beyond 4 o'clock. I think probably people have had a reasonably long week already this week, so we'll try and stick reasonably to time. We're back in this room for 2 o'clock. I don't know, Mr. Long, are you going to join us for Newport? Are you? Okay, that's fine. Yeah. Okay. So,
sure, David.
Okay. Okay. So thank you, everybody. We'll reconvene back here, please, for 2 o'clock. Thank you.